A lonely millionaire entered the wrong room on a rainy and silent night. On the bed, asleep, was the young maid who had never been touched. She didn't move, didn't speak, but felt something that changed her soul forever. If you enjoy stories of love and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. The January rain battered the windows of the century-old mansion in High Point Heights, Boston, where the Montgomery Institute operated, an art and culture foundation carrying decades of history within its marble walls and noble woodwork. For those passing by Consolation Street, the imposing building represented tradition and philanthropy. But those who knew its intimate corridors understood that some wounds never heal, and that the past has a habit of haunting the living with the persistence of phantom pain. Elena Christina Parker walked through the silent corridors with the lightness of someone who had learned to be invisible. At 23, she was the Institute's night cleaner, the one who cleaned up the traces of grand events and swept under Persian rugs the crumbs of a Boston that she knew only through leftovers. Raised at St. Clair Home, an orphanage in the East Side, after her mother Alice had mysteriously disappeared when she was only 5, Elena developed an armor of silence and submission that protected her from the world, but also kept her prisoner of her own loneliness. Her grey eyes rarely lifted beyond what was necessary. Her body, thin and delicate, had never known the intimate touch of a man, not from religious modesty but from a visceral fear that had settled in her gut since childhood. For Eleanor, proximity meant danger, and love was a word that existed only in movies that played on the orphanage television. She cleaned the halls where couples danced, arranged flowers that lovers sent, made the beds in guest rooms where the rich consummated their romances, but never imagined that one day she would be the protagonist of her own story. Adrian Montgomery was 41 and carried the weight of a surname that opened doors and closed hearts. Tall, dark, with eyes that seemed to hold storms, he walked through the Institute's spaces as if he owned not just the place, but everything his eyes could reach. Son of Oliver Montgomery, the Institute's founder, Adrian had inherited not only the fortune built in the import business, but also the scars of a childhood marked by expensive and distant boarding schools, by the calculated coldness of a father who saw his son as an extension of his business, never as a human being. Divorced for 5 years from a Boston socialite who had traded him for a younger businessman, Adrian had developed a reputation as an inaccessible man. His relationships were brief, elegant, and devoid of any trace of emotional vulnerability. He believed that love was a romantic invention to justify desire and convenience, and that all passion had an expiration date. He directed the Institute more out of family obligation than vocation, keeping himself distant from employees and treating philanthropy as an efficient, well-administered business. On that rainy January night, the Institute was hosting another of its famous charity auctions. Boston's elite crowded the main halls, drinking French champagne and bidding on artwork, while discussing politics and gossip. Adrian circulated among the guests with his usual cold elegance, greeting people whose names he had memorized, but whose stories didn't interest him. That's when he received an envelope discreetly delivered by his secretary. The paper was yellowed, the postmark indicating uncertain origin. Inside, handwriting he recognized immediately, even after so many years. Adrian, I need to see you. I'm not dead. I'm coming back. Vincent. Vincent, his younger brother, who disappeared 12 years ago after a terrible fight with their father. Presumed dead after months of fruitless searches, Vincent represented for Adrian the only person he had truly loved in his life. The letter trembled in his hands. The room began to spin around him. He mumbled some excuse to the nearest guests and headed to the bar, where he consumed 3 shots of Scotch whiskey in succession, making the bartender frown. The rain intensified outside, beating against the windows with hypnotic insistence. The alcohol burned in Adrian's throat, but couldn't dissolve the knot forming in his chest. Vincent alive. Vincent coming back. 12 years of mourning, of guilt, of nights lying awake thinking about what he could have done differently. Would they unravel like this, in an unexpected letter? He needed air, silence, a place where he could process this information without the curious glances of Boston high society. He climbed the marble stairs leading to the 2nd floor, where the family's old quarters were located. The East Wing was always empty during events, preserved as a time capsule where furniture covered by white sheets guarded memories of a time when the mansion still housed a family, not just an institution. Adrian pushed open the door to one of the bedrooms, breathing in the lavender scent that hung in the air. Someone had recently cleaned the room. The sheets on the antique bed were stretched with military precision, the pillows carefully arranged. He threw himself on the bed, still dressed in his gala tuxedo, the crumpled letter between his fingers. The rain outside created a melancholy melody that matched the whirlwind of feelings exploding in his chest. The whiskey did its work, blurring the edges of reality, transforming thoughts into fog. Adrian closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like to reunite with Vincent, what they would say to each other after so long, if they would still be the same men who had parted in anger on that distant night. It was in this state of alcoholic vulnerability that Adrian fell asleep, the letter still pressed against his chest, while downstairs the party continued with its predictable rhythm of empty conversations and forced laughter. The sound of rain had intensified, creating a sound curtain that isolated the room from the rest of the world. He didn't hear the light footsteps approaching down the corridor, nor the soft creak of the door being carefully opened. Elena had finished cleaning the ground-floor bathrooms and was heading upstairs to complete her nightly routine in the East Wing. It was always like this. While the rich enjoyed themselves in the main halls, she circulated through forgotten spaces, ensuring that every corner of the institute maintained its impeccable appearance for the next day. She had learned to move like a ghost, avoiding crossing paths with guests or administration staff. Her existence was accepted, but not acknowledged. She was part of the invisible structure that kept that world functioning. When she pushed open the bedroom door and saw the male silhouette lying on the bed, her first instinct was to retreat. But something made her hesitate. The man was motionless, breathing with the heavy rhythm of someone who had drunk too much. She immediately recognized Adrian Montgomery, the institute's owner, who in 3 years of work had never directed a single word to her. He seemed different like this, without the armor of coldness he usually wore. His dark hair was disheveled, his tuxedo wrinkled, and there was a vulnerability in his posture that contrasted with the image of absolute control he projected during the day. Eleanor should have left immediately. It was protocol, the unwritten rule. Employees like her didn't belong in the same space as people like him, but fatigue weighed on her bones. She had started her shift at 9 in the evening, and it was almost 3 in the morning. Her feet ached in worn-out shoes. Her back complained from hours bent over cleaning, and there was something about the environment, perfumed by the lavender she herself had sprayed on the sheets, that attracted her like a refuge. Just a few minutes, she thought, just to rest her legs before continuing cleaning. She sat on the edge of the bed, as far as possible from Adrian, and closed her eyes. The sound of rain was hypnotic, and the lavender scent mixed with the masculine aroma of expensive aftershave created an atmosphere she had never experienced. For the first time in years, Elena felt protected, as if that room existed outside the cruel rules of the real world. Fatigue overcame her faster than she had imagined. She slid to the side, her head finding the softness of the down pillows. Her brown hair spread like a dark veil against the white fabric. She fell asleep with her breathing synchronized to the rain, unaware that she had crossed an invisible line that separated her life from his. It was an hour later that Adrian stirred. Alcohol still clouded his senses, transforming reality into disconnected fragments. He perceived the female presence beside him through a nebulous consciousness, registering the delicate scent of clean skin mixed with the lavender from the sheets. In his altered state, his mind processed the situation through the filter of past experiences. It wasn't uncommon that at events like this, some staff member would discreetly provide female company for special guests. It had happened before. Silent arrangements that were part of the unofficial courtesies of the world in which he lived. He turned, still immersed in an alcoholic haze that distorted perceptions and judgments. His hand found the delicate curve of a hip, the texture of a simple uniform that his intoxicated mind interpreted as provocative lingerie. The touch provoked an immediate reaction in Elena, who awoke with a start but didn't move. A strange paralysis took hold of her, mixing terror and fascination in a proportion she couldn't comprehend. She should have screamed, should have fled, should have defended herself. But something in her body betrayed all the instincts of self-preservation she had developed over the years. Perhaps it was the way he touched her, not with the brutality she had always feared, but with an almost reverent delicacy, as if she were made of crystal. Perhaps it was the accumulated neediness of years without any kind of physical affection, the emotional emptiness that opened like a hungry abyss before the first demonstration of desire someone had directed at her. Elena closed her eyes tightly and pretended to continue sleeping, while Adrian, lost in his own mental confusion, explored her body with the hands of a man who believed he was living a consensual fantasy. The rain outside muffled any sound, creating a cocoon of forced intimacy where two opposite worlds met in the most incorrect way possible. What happened that night was not violence in the traditional sense, but neither was it consent. It was an impossible encounter between two solitudes, mediated by alcohol, darkness, and misunderstandings, that would forever transform both their lives. When Adrian finally penetrated Elena, breaking the physical barrier of her virginity, she felt something break inside her, not just her hymen, but an emotional wall she had built to protect herself from the world. Dawn arrived with the cruelty of an inevitable revelation. Adrian awoke with a heavy head and dry mouth, unmistakable characteristics of a hangover that promised to last all day. The first ray of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air like morning ghosts. He moved slowly, registering the strange sensation of having slept fully clothed, his wrinkled tuxedo sticking to his sweaty body. It was then that reality hit him like a punch to the stomach. There was blood on the sheets, not much, just a few dark drops that contrasted with the immaculate whiteness of the fabric. And there was a different scent in the air, feminine and delicate, that didn't match the expensive perfume of the women he usually dated. Adrian sat up in bed with his heart racing, trying to piece together fragments of the previous night into a coherent narrative. Vincent's letter, the whiskey, going up to the room, and then there was a female presence, delicate hands, soft skin, an encounter that his intoxicated memory had registered as consensual, but the bloodstains suggested something different, something that made him feel nausea unrelated to alcohol. Virginity. The word echoed in his mind like a condemnation. He got up quickly, looking for clues about the identity of the woman who had been there. He found nothing but a faint scent of lavender and cleanliness, which awakened an uncomfortable memory. This smell he knew. It was the fragrance that always lingered in the hallways after the night cleaning crew passed through. His stomach twisted in a mixture of horror and disbelief. Eleanor had disappeared before dawn, moving through the corridors with the same invisibility that characterized her, but carrying within her a transformation that no amount of silence could hide. She returned to her small apartment in Madison Village, a studio she shared with Carla, a colleague who worked as a cashier at the corner supermarket. She locked herself in the tiny bathroom and stayed under the shower until the cold water ran out, trying to wash away the memory of those male hands from her skin. But she couldn't erase the memory of the sensation. For the first time in her life, Eleanor had experienced physical pleasure. Even amid the confusion, fear, and inappropriateness of the situation, her body had responded in a way that left her simultaneously ashamed and curious. She didn't know if what had happened could be classified as rape. After all, she hadn't screamed, hadn't resisted, had even felt pleasure. But she also hadn't consciously consented. She was lost in a moral limbo that she couldn't name. During the days that followed, Eleanor and Adrian developed an elaborate dance of mutual avoidance. She changed her hours, starting work later to reduce the chances of crossing paths with him in the corridors. He in turn avoided the spaces of the institute where he knew she transited, delegating more responsibilities to administrative staff so as not to need to circulate so much around the building. But the tension between them was palpable. When they finally met on a rainy Thursday, on the main staircase that she was climbing with a bucket and cleaning supplies, the air seemed to electrify instantly. Helena stopped in the middle of the flight of stairs, her grey eyes fixed on the floor, while Adrian descended with his usual elegance. They crossed at the same step, their bodies almost touching. It was then that Adrian saw her face for the first time with attention. Really saw. The delicate features, the large expressive eyes, the vulnerability she carried like a second skin. And it was then that he knew with absolute certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. It hadn't been a companion discreetly provided. It had been her, the invisible cleaner, the girl who cleaned up his traces without ever being noticed. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice coming out hoarse and laden with a guilt he didn't know how to express. Elena raised her eyes for the first time, and the impact of that gaze was devastating. There was pain there, but there was also something more. An intensity he hadn't expected, a spark of defiance that contrasted with her apparent submission. "For what?" she asked, and her voice was firmer than he had imagined. "For touching me or for noticing me?" The question caught him off guard. He expected tears, accusations, perhaps even a threat of reporting him. He didn't expect this wounded dignity, this ability to confront him with words that cut deeper than any scream. They stood there, in the middle of the staircase, like two statues trapped in a moment of unbearable tension. Elena waited for an answer he didn't know how to give. Adrian searched for words that could fix what had been broken, but discovered that certain actions don't admit simple repair. "I didn't know it was you," he finally said, and immediately realized how inadequate that sounded. "I was drunk. I confused the situation." The words died in his throat when he saw the expression of disappointment in her eyes. It was as if he had confirmed exactly what she most feared, that for him, she was so invisible that even after having shared intimacy, he hadn't recognized her as a person. "Of course you didn't know," Elena responded, adjusting the bucket with a dignity that made his heart contract. "For you people like me don't really exist, do we? We're just part of the decoration, like the furniture or the plants." She continued up the staircase, leaving him standing there, with the weight of his own actions crushing his chest like a tombstone. In the weeks that followed the encounter on the staircase, a silent obsession began to consume Adrian from within. He found himself looking for Elena in the corridors, memorizing her schedules, inventing excuses to circulate in the spaces where she worked. It wasn't simple sexual desire. It was something deeper and more disturbing. It was as if she had left an invisible mark on him, a wound that bled every time he remembered those grey eyes and the wounded dignity with which she had faced his pathetic attempt at an apology. Elena, in turn, lived in a state of constant alertness. Each noise in the corridor made her heart race. Each male shadow left her tense, but there was something contradictory in her reactions. At the same time that she feared meeting him again, a secret part of herself yearned for these moments. During the fateful night, for the first time in her life, she had felt desired, even if in the most incorrect way possible. And that sensation, however wrong it might be, had awakened in her a curiosity about herself that haunted her. It was on a March afternoon when the Boston heat began to give way that Elena decided to do something she had never dared before. She began to investigate her own history. During work breaks, she started to discreetly search through the Institute's old files, looking for any record that might clarify the disappearance of her mother, Alice Parker. The Institute's basement housed decades of documents, photographs, and correspondence. It was a labyrinth of dusty shelves where the official history of the institution coexisted with secrets that had never seen the light of day. Elena discovered that her mother had worked there as an archivist between 1999 and 2001, cataloging artwork and historical documents. The official photographs showed a young, beautiful woman with the same grey eyes as Elena, always dressed with professional sobriety. But it was in a yellowed folder, stored in the back of a drawer that seemed unopened for years, that Elena found something that made her blood freeze. They were personal letters from Alice, written during her pregnancy, addressed to a recipient identified only as OM. The letters spoke of a forbidden relationship, of pressures to keep quiet, of promises of protection that were never fulfilled. "He said he would take care of us," read one of the letters. "That the child would have a future, that I wouldn't need to worry. But I see in his eyes that he's afraid. Afraid of his wife, afraid of scandal, afraid of losing everything he's built. And me? What will become of me and the baby when I can no longer hide my belly?" Elena's heart beat erratically as she read. The initials OM could only mean one thing: Oliver Montgomery, Adrian's father. Her mother had had an affair with the Institute's founder, and if the dates were correct, Elena could be his daughter. The discovery was like an earthquake in her emotional foundations. If it were true, it would mean that she and Adrian were half-siblings, that the night they had shared was not just a mistake, but an abomination. She held the letters with trembling hands, trying to process the implications of her discovery. Adrian, during this same period, was also dealing with his own family ghosts. Vincent's letter continued to haunt him, but he hadn't received more news from his brother. He began to review old family documents, searching for clues about where Vincent might be. when he found a box of correspondence from his mother, Marianne Montgomery. Among the social letters and invitations to charity events, there were some personal notes that he had never read carefully. In one of them, dated 2001, his mother mentioned the embarrassing situation with the archivist and the need to resolve the problem before it becomes a public scandal. There were vague references to a bastard child and the questionable methods that Oliver was willing to use to protect the family's reputation. The connection wasn't explicit, but something in the tone of the letters awakened a terrible suspicion in Adrian's chest. He vaguely remembered rumors whispered among the older staff of a young archivist who had suddenly disappeared, leaving her work half-finished. At the time, he was in his final year of business administration at Harvard and hadn't paid attention to the details of his family's domestic life. Now these fragmented memories gained a sinister meaning. What if his father had really had an affair with an employee? What if a child had been born from that relationship? Adrian felt his stomach turn when a terrible possibility crossed his mind. Elena was the right age to be that child. It was with this suspicion, eating away at his sanity, that he decided to confront Sebastian, the retired butler who had served the family for more than 30 years. The old man lived in a simple house in Pembroke, supported by the pension that the Montgomery family had paid him since his retirement. When Adrian appeared at his door on a grey autumn afternoon, Sebastian received him with his usual deference, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this visit wasn't unexpected. "Mr. Sebastian," Adrian said, sitting in the modest living room decorated with photographs of the Montgomery family from decades past. "I need you to tell me about Alice Parker, the archivist who worked at the Institute more than 20 years ago." The old man's face immediately closed like an oyster protecting its most precious pearl. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Adrian. My memory isn't what it used to be." But Adrian had learned from his father to read between the lines of evasions. "My father had an affair with her, didn't he?" The direct question made Sebastian sigh deeply, as if he had carried the weight of this secret for too long. "Your father was a powerful man, Mr. Adrian. Powerful men do things they later need to hide." The answer was evasive but confirmatory. "The young woman disappeared on a stormy night. No one ever heard from her again. Your father said she had returned to her family upstate, but I saw her eyes before she left. They weren't the eyes of someone going to meet beloved relatives." "And the child?" Adrian asked, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "Was there a child?" Sebastian closed his eyes, as if trying to decide if some truths deserved to remain buried. When he opened them again, there was a deep sadness in them that spoke of decades of forced complicity. "There was a little girl, tiny with grey eyes like her mother's. Your father had her placed in St. Clair Home, said it would be better that way, that the child would have opportunities he couldn't give openly." Sebastian paused, studying Adrian's face. "Why are you asking about this now, sir?" Adrian left Sebastian's house like a destroyed man. The confirmation of his suspicions had transformed the guilt he felt into an existential nausea that accompanied him throughout the trip back to High Point Heights. If Elena was really his half-sister, what had happened between them that night transcended any category of error he knew. It was a violation of cosmic order, a sin that had no name or forgiveness. He drove through the streets of Boston in a trance, passing through traffic lights without really seeing them, navigating more by muscle memory than by consciousness. When he finally arrived at the Institute, it was almost midnight. The building was immersed in its usual darkness, with only the security lights illuminating the corridors through which Elena certainly walked at that moment, fulfilling her invisible routine. The irony of the situation hit him with devastating force. For weeks he had fantasized about her, invented casual encounters, developed an obsession that he confused with genuine attraction. Now he discovered that this woman, who had become the center of his most intimate thoughts, could be the very sister that cruel fate had hidden from him for more than 2 decades. Elena, at that same moment, was in the Institute's basement, surrounded by the documents she had found, trying to piece together the puzzle of her origin. Besides her mother's letters, she had discovered financial records showing regular money transfers from Oliver Montgomery's personal account to St. Clair Home, always on the same day of the month, always the same amount, for exactly 18 years. The payments had ceased in the month of her 18th birthday. The evidence was circumstantial but convincing. Oliver Montgomery had supported her education in the orphanage. Fulfilling a paternal responsibility, he had never publicly assumed. This explained why she had always received slightly better treatment than the other orphans, why she had managed to complete high school when many children were removed from school to work, why she had never experienced the extreme hardships some of her colleagues had, but it also explained the loneliness she had always felt. She wasn't a common orphan. She was a living secret, evidence of transgression that needed to be kept hidden but couldn't be completely eliminated. Her existence had been tolerated, financially supported, but never acknowledged or loved. It was while she was absorbed in these discoveries that she heard footsteps on the floor above. Male footsteps, heavy, that she recognized immediately. Adrian was at the institute, probably in his office, perhaps working late as he tended to do when something disturbed him. Elena felt her heart accelerate, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a strange mixture of anticipation and terror, as if a part of her knew that the final confrontation was approaching. She put the documents in a folder and silently went up to the ground floor. The light in Adrian's office was on, a golden rectangle cutting through the darkness of the main corridor. She could see him through the half-open door, sitting behind the mahogany desk, his head in his hands in a posture of despair that brutally contrasted with the image of control he always projected. Eleanor stood at the doorway for long minutes, observing him. There was something touching in his vulnerability, something that awakened in her a maternal impulse she didn't know she possessed. This man, who represented everything she could never have in life, was suffering in a way she recognized, the pain of carrying secrets too heavy for one person's shoulders. "You found out too, didn't you?" she finally said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. Adrian jerked his head up, his eyes red and injected with a sadness that seemed to have roots much deeper than recent guilt. "Elena," he pronounced her name as if it were a prayer or a curse, unable to decide which. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be near me." "Why?" She entered the office, closing the door behind her, with a soft click that echoed like a shot in the charged atmosphere. "Because we're siblings? Because your father destroyed my mother? Because you touched me without knowing who I was?" Each question was a sharp blade that cut deeper into wounds already open in Adrian's soul. He rose from his chair, walking to the window that overlooked the institute's inner garden, where a century-old fig tree extended its branches like arms in lamentation. "Because all of this is my fault," he said, his voice laden with a guilt that went beyond the night they had shared. "If I had paid attention, if I had questioned my father about the employees who disappeared, if I had been less cowardly." The words were lost in a sigh that carried decades of omissions and unintentional complicities. "You were 18 when I was born," Eleanor responded, approaching him with measured steps. "You were almost a child too. You can't blame yourself for your father's sins. But I can blame myself for what I did to you." He turned to face her, and the proximity between them created an electric tension that completely contradicted the familial nature of their supposed relationship. "I can blame myself for desiring you even after knowing who you are." The confession left his lips like a whispered blasphemy. Elena felt the air fail in her lungs, not from the horror of the revelation, but from the intensity of the desire she recognized in his eyes, a desire that dangerously echoed what she herself felt and was trying to suppress. "And I can blame myself for still dreaming about your hands on my body," she said, her voice trembling with the audacity of her own honesty. "For wanting to understand why that night, which should have destroyed me, made me feel alive for the first time." They stood facing each other, separated by less than a yard, but by a moral abyss that seemed insurmountable. The air between them vibrated with a sexual tension that defied all social and familial conventions. It was wrong. It was impossible. It was the most dangerous thing they could feel for each other. "This can't happen," Adrian murmured, but his body betrayed his words, leaning slightly toward her. "We can't." "I know," Elena replied, but she also moved closer as if drawn by a magnetic force against which she couldn't fight. "I know it's wrong. I know we're—" "Don't say it," he interrupted her, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Please don't say that word, not now." They were so close that they could feel the heat of each other's bodies, their breaths mixing in an accelerated rhythm that betrayed the desire they both tried to deny. Adrian's hands rose instinctively, as if to touch Elena's face, but stopped midway, trembling with the effort to contain himself. It was Elena who broke the moment of unbearable tension. She suddenly backed away, as if burned by an invisible flame, and walked to the bookcase that occupied an entire wall of the office. Her hands trembled as she pretended to examine the leather-bound titles, but her mind was in complete turmoil. What had almost happened between them transcended any moral limit she knew, and the most terrifying thing was discovering that a secret part of herself wished it had happened. "I need to know the truth," she said, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "I need to know if we really are. If your father is—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Adrian perfectly understood what she was trying to say. "I need to know too," he replied, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "But how will we find out? My father has been dead for 5 years. Your mother disappeared more than 20 years ago. The only ones who could confirm the truth are gone." "Not the only ones," Elena said, turning to face him with a determination that surprised him. "There's something I didn't tell you. I found more than letters in the basement. I found a diary from my mother, with pages torn out. The last entry talks about the Room of Mirrors, a wing of the institute that was sealed off after a fire 20 years ago." Adrian felt his blood freeze in his veins. The Room of Mirrors. He hadn't heard that name in decades, but the memories came back with the force of an emotional tsunami. It was one of the rooms in the west wing of the institute, originally designed as a private dance hall for the Montgomery family. The walls were covered with antique Venetian mirrors, and the ceiling had a skylight that during the day created a spectacle of light and reflections. As a child, Adrian used to play in that room, fascinated by the way his image multiplied infinitely in the mirrors. But when he turned 12, his father strictly forbade him and Vincent from entering there. "It's not a place for children," Oliver would say whenever the boys approached that door. After the fire, the entire wing was sealed, officially for structural safety reasons. "My father always said the fire was an electrical accident," Adrian murmured, the pieces of a dark puzzle beginning to fit in his mind. "But now I'm wondering if it wasn't intentional, if he didn't set fire to the room to destroy evidence." "Evidence of what?" Elena asked, although a part of her already knew the answer. "Of what he did there. With whom he did it. Your mother wasn't the first employee to mysteriously disappear, Eleanor. During my adolescence, there were others, always young women, always beautiful, always with vague stories about moving to other cities." Adrian sat heavily in the leather armchair, as if the weight of his own suspicions was too much to bear standing. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea as she understood the implications of what he was suggesting. Her possible father had not just been a powerful man who had taken advantage of a vulnerable employee. He had been a serial predator who used his position to abuse women who depended on him to survive. "We need to enter that room," she said, her voice laden with a cold determination that masked the emotional storm in her chest. "We need to see what's left in there. If there's anything that can give us answers—" "It's been sealed for 2 decades, Adrian protested. "And even if we could get in, what do we expect to find after so long?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, "but it's the only clue we have. And I'd rather face any horrible truth than live the rest of my life not knowing who I really am. Not knowing if we—" She stopped again, unable to verbalize the dilemma consuming them. Adrian observed her for long moments, seeing in her a courage that he himself wasn't sure he possessed. There was something about Elena that fascinated him beyond physical desire, an inner strength that had been forged by adversity, a capacity to face difficult truths that he, raised in a golden cradle, had never needed to develop. "All right," he said finally, "let's go to the Room of Mirrors. But if we find what I'm afraid we'll find, promise me one thing." He stood up, approaching her again, but maintaining a respectful distance. "Promise that you won't judge me for what my father did, that you won't hate me for carrying his surname." "How can I promise that when I still don't know if I can forgive myself for what I feel for you?" Elena replied with a brutal honesty that left him speechless. They spent the following hour planning how they would enter the sealed wing. Adrian still had the Institute's master keys, inherited from his position as director, but access to the Room of Mirrors was blocked by plywood and danger signs. They would need to be discreet, enter during the early morning hours when there were no staff around. While discussing the practical details, they both carefully avoided mentioning the emotional elephant that dominated the environment. The attraction between them had not diminished with the discoveries about their possible kinship. If anything, it had intensified, acquiring a forbidden and desperate tone that made each moment they were in the same environment an exquisite torture. Elena found herself observing Adrian's hands as he drew a sketch of the West Wing's layout, remembering how those same hands had explored her body on that fateful night. Adrian, in turn, couldn't help but notice the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, an unconscious gesture that awakened sensory memories he should be repressing. "Tomorrow night," he said when they finished planning. "After the last cleaning staff leaves, we'll meet at the entrance to the West Wing at 2 in the morning." "Agreed," Elena concurred, but when she rose to leave, he gently held her arm. "Elena," he said. And there was something in his voice that made her stop and face him. "Regardless of what we discover tomorrow, I want you to know that you are not invisible to me. You never will be again." She looked at his hand on her arm, at the point where their skin touched, and created an electric spark that contradicted everything she should be feeling. When she raised her eyes to meet his, there were tears that refused to fall. "Sometimes," she said softly, "being invisible hurts less than being seen in the wrong way." And with those words, she gently freed herself from his touch and left the office, leaving him alone with the weight of his own contradictions and the scent of lavender that always seemed to accompany her wherever she went. The early morning arrived laden with humidity, typical of Boston's autumn, with that cold that penetrates the bones and makes people shrink inside their coats. Elena had spent the hours prior to the scheduled meeting walking aimlessly through the neighborhood streets, unable to stay still in her apartment with her thoughts in turmoil. Carla, her roommate, had asked if everything was okay. But how could she explain that she might have discovered that the man for whom she was developing forbidden feelings could be her half-brother? When she arrived at the entrance to the West Wing of the Institute, she found Adrian already waiting, leaning against the solid wooden door that had remained sealed for 2 decades. He seemed as restless as she was, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly, a nervous habit she was learning to recognize. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked when she approached, his voice low, echoing in the empty corridor. "Once we open this door, we can no longer pretend ignorance about what we find inside." "Pretending ignorance is a luxury that people like me have never had," Elena replied, adjusting the small flashlight she had brought. "I need to know who I am, Adrian, even if the truth is worse than any lie I've told myself all these years." He studied her for a moment in the dim light of the corridors, seeing in her a determination that made him feel both pride and terror simultaneously. There was something heroic in the way she faced the possibility of discovering devastating truths, a courage that brutally contrasted with his own tendency to avoid difficult emotional confrontations. Adrian used one of the master keys to open the first padlock, then the second. The mechanism creaked with the protest of years without use. When they finally managed to remove the boards blocking the passage, stale, mold-laden air escaped from inside, like a ghostly sigh from the past. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Not just mold and thyme, but something more subtle and disturbing. A sweet, sickening aroma that could have been feminine perfume mixed with something neither of them could identify. Adrian lit a more powerful flashlight he had brought, and the beam revealed a spectacle that was both beautiful and macabre. The room of mirrors had partially survived the fire. Some sections of the mirrored walls remained intact, creating distorted and fragmented reflections that multiplied their silhouettes at impossible angles. Other areas showed black scars from the fire, melted glass that had flowed like frozen tears, creating abstract forms that resembled human faces trapped in eternal suffering. In the center of the room, miraculously preserved, was a red velvet divan that seemed to have been strategically positioned to be reflected in all the surviving mirrors. Around it, scattered on the floor covered with glass shards and debris, were objects that told a sinister story. A feminine silk robe in faded blue tones, a pair of high-heeled shoes that clearly didn't belong to any socialite, empty perfume bottles, and something that made both their stomachs turn. Polaroid photographs partially damaged by fire. Helena carefully bent down, avoiding the mirror shards, and collected some of the less damaged photographs. The images showed women in intimate poses, clearly uncomfortable, some with faces visible enough to be recognized. They were Institute employees, she was sure. Young and vulnerable women who had been lured or coerced into that room to satisfy Oliver Montgomery's dark appetites. "My God," Adrian murmured, looking over her shoulder at the photographs. He documented everything. He turned this into a personal trophy. The disgust in his voice was genuine, mixed with a deep shame for carrying the blood of a man capable of such atrocities. It was then that Elena saw something that made her heart stop. Among the photographs was one showing a woman with brown hair and grey eyes, clearly pregnant, standing next to the red divan. The woman looked at the camera with an expression of resignation and terror that cut like a blade. It was Alice Parker. It was her mother. She was pregnant in the photo, Elena said, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. Very pregnant. He brought her here even knowing she was carrying a child. Her hands trembled as she held the photograph, trying to process the magnitude of the violation her mother had suffered. Adrian felt a wave of nausea as he understood the implications. His father had not just abused female employees, he had abused pregnant women, transformed motherhood into another form of humiliation and control. And if Elena had been conceived during one of these forced encounters, that didn't make her his half-sister. It made her the victim of a violence that preceded her birth. "We need to look for more evidence," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the horror he felt. "If there are photographs, there may be documents, something that definitively clarifies who your father is." They methodically searched the room, finding more horrors with each discovery. There was a small safe hidden behind one of the cracked mirrors, which Adrian managed to open using a combination he recognized, his grandfather's birth date. Inside the safe were documents that confirmed their worst suspicions. Detailed records of forced encounters, including dates, names of women, and, in some cases, consequences such as pregnancies or disappearances. Alice Parker's name appeared several times in the records, always accompanied by cold clinical notes about her cooperative behavior and her confirmed fertility. But what made Elena feel her legs weaken was a specific note dated 3 months before her birth. AP complains about paternity, denies involvement. Solution: permanent transfer. Child will be adequately cared for through discreet channels. "He never admitted he was my father," Elena said, the revelation coming as both a relief and a disappointment. "In the notes, he always refers to my mother's pregnancy as something inconvenient, but never admits responsibility. He may have abused her, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm his daughter." Adrian flipped through more pages of the records, looking for any additional information. That's when he found something that completely changed the course of their investigations. There was an entry dated 2 days after Elena's birth, written in a different handwriting, more feminine and delicate. It was a note from Marianne Montgomery, Adrian's mother. "I spoke today with James Roberts, the doctor who attended the archivist's delivery. He confirmed that the child has AB negative blood type, the same as the Portuguese gardener that the mother was secretly meeting. Oliver may have abused the young woman, but he is not the child's father. The real paternity must remain secret to protect everyone's reputation. The child will be supported as a gesture of charity, not family responsibility." The silence that followed the reading of this revelation was deafening. Eleanor and Adrian looked at each other through the fragmented reflections of the broken mirrors, slowly processing what this meant. Oliver Montgomery had abused Elena's mother, had blackmailed her and probably caused her disappearance, but he wasn't her biological father. The real father was a Portuguese gardener who had worked at the Institute, a man whose name hadn't even been recorded in the documents they found. "We're not siblings," Adrian finally said, his voice laden with a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something that could be interpreted as hope. "No," Eleanor agreed, but there were tears in her eyes that spoke of a different pain. "We're not siblings, but that doesn't change the fact that your family destroyed mine. It doesn't change the fact that I exist because your mother preferred to cover up crimes rather than protect innocent women." The revelation about Elena's true paternity should have been liberating, but it brought with it a new kind of pain. Now she knew she wasn't Oliver Montgomery's daughter, which resolved the moral dilemma of her attraction to Adrian, but she also discovered that her existence had been the result of a clandestine affair covered up by a network of lies that included his entire family. Her mother had been a victim of abuse, blackmail, and finally, a disappearance that had probably cost her life. In the days that followed the discovery in the room of mirrors, Adrian and Elena developed a strange dynamic. They avoided each other during the day, but seemed magnetically attracted to each other at night. She continued fulfilling her cleaning shifts, but now he stayed at the Institute later, creating excuses to be there when he knew she would be working. They didn't talk about what they had discovered, but there was a palpable tension in the air whenever their paths crossed. It was on a rainy Thursday that the situation finally exploded. Eleanor was cleaning the main hall when she accidentally dropped a crystal vase that shattered on the marble floor with a noise that echoed through the empty corridors. She bent down to collect the shards, but a particularly sharp fragment cut her hand, making her release a muffled cry of pain. Adrian, who was in his office reviewing documents he couldn't really read due to constant distraction, heard the noise and ran to the hall. He found Elena kneeling on the floor trying to stop the bleeding with a cleaning cloth, surrounded by the ruins of the antique vase. "Let me see," he said, kneeling beside her without thinking twice. He took her injured hand carefully, examining the cut that was deeper than she had realized. "It needs stitches. I'll take you to the hospital." "It's not necessary," Elena protested, but her voice trembled when he gently touched the skin around the wound. "I can take care of this at home. I've cut myself before." "You're not going to take care of anything alone," Adrian said, with a firmness that admitted no discussion. "And I don't care how much the vase costs. These things can be replaced." "You can't." The intensity in his voice made Eleanor raise her eyes to meet his, and what she saw there left her breathless. There was something more than concern in his dark eyes. There was a fierce, protective care that she had never seen directed at her before. It was as if the mere possibility of her being hurt was unbearable to him. Adrian helped her stand up, keeping her injured hand elevated to reduce bleeding. "My car is in the garage," he said. "Let's go." During the journey to the nearest hospital, they remained silent, but there was a new intimacy in the air. Adrian drove with one hand, the other holding Elena's to maintain pressure on the wound. It was the first deliberate and affectionate touch they had shared since the night that had changed everything, and the sensation of his skin against hers sent waves of heat up Elena's arm. At the hospital, Adrian insisted on accompanying her throughout the entire process. He spoke with the doctors in his usual authoritative tone, ensuring she received the best possible treatment. He held her free hand while the doctor sutured the cut, feeling each time she contracted in pain, as if he himself were being wounded. "Why are you doing this?" Elena asked when they finally left the hospital, her hand wrapped in clean bandages. "Why are you taking care of me?" Adrian stopped in the middle of the parking lot, the yellowish streetlights creating a halo around both of them in the darkness of the early morning. "Because I can't stop," he admitted, his voice laden with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "Since that night, since I really saw you for the first time, I can't stop thinking about you. And it's not just sexual desire, Eleanor. It's something deeper, more frightening." "More frightening how?" she asked, although a part of her already knew the answer. "Like love," he said simply, the words coming out like a confession forcibly extracted. "I've fallen in love with you, and that's terrible, because you have every reason in the world to hate me. Because of what my father did to your mother. Because of what I did to you that first night. Because of all the pain my family caused yours." Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes. "And you think I don't know that? You think I don't spend every night wondering how I can feel what I feel for a man whose surname represents everything that was denied to me in life?" She walked up to him, closing the distance between them. "You think it's easy for me to admit that I've fallen in love with you too?" The mutual confession hung in the air between them, like a bridge over an abyss. They were standing in the empty parking lot of a hospital, with Elena's injured hand throbbing and the weight of dark family secrets on their shoulders. But somehow that moment seemed the most honest of their lives. "So, what do we do now?" Adrian asked, raising a hand to gently touch her face. "How do we build something real on top of so much pain?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, leaning into his touch despite all the rational reasons to pull away. "But I know I don't want to pretend I don't feel this anymore. I don't want to live as if I were invisible, especially to myself." He leaned in then and kissed her. It wasn't like the first time, mediated by confusion and alcohol. It was deliberate, conscious, an act of mutual choice that defied all the social conventions that separated them. The kiss tasted of salty tears and impossible possibilities, of desperation and hope mixed in a proportion that shouldn't exist. When they separated, both were crying. "My family will disown me if they find out," Adrian whispered against her forehead. "Society will crucify us. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand," Elena responded, but there was a new strength in her voice that he hadn't heard before. "But for the first time in my life, I've found something worth fighting for. Someone who sees me as more than a victim or an invisible employee. And if I'm going to lose this because of what other people think, then I'd rather never have known any love at all. Her declaration was like lightning that illuminated something in Adrian's chest. Throughout his life, he had made decisions based on social approval, on maintaining an impeccable image, on preserving the status quo. But there, standing in that parking lot with a woman who had been born to be invisible, but who had become the most real person he had ever known, he realized that perhaps it was time to choose truth over convenience. "Then let's fight," he said, sealing the promise with another kiss that tasted of revolution and rebirth. "Let's fight for this, whatever happens." At that moment, they had no idea that the fight would be more brutal than anything they could imagine, and that the price of their love would be measured not just in lost reputation, but in sacrifices that would test the limits of their determination. The decision to fight together for the love they had discovered brought a temporary feeling of relief, but reality didn't take long to impose itself with all its cruelty. 3 weeks after the night at the hospital, when Adrian and Elena were beginning to build a secret routine of stolen encounters in forgotten corners of the Institute, their world collapsed in a way neither had foreseen. It all began with a call that Adrian received on a Monday morning. On the other end of the line was Beatrice Montgomery Davis, his older cousin and one of the family matriarchs, known for her sharp tongue and her ability to sniff out scandals miles away. She had received anonymous information about Adrian's relationship with an employee, accompanied by photographs that someone had discreetly taken of the two of them together. "Have you completely lost your mind, Adrian?" Her voice echoed through the phone with an icy fury that he had known since childhood. "A cleaner? You're destroying everything our family has worked for generations because of a sordid adventure with the help." Adrian felt his blood freeze when he realized their relationship had been discovered. "It's not an adventure," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "And she's not just a cleaner. Elena is—" "Elena!" Beatrice interrupted him with a sarcastic laugh that cut like a blade. "You don't even try to hide it anymore, do you? You're so far from reality that you don't even realize how this sounds. A Montgomery in love with a woman who cleans our bathrooms. Your father must be turning in his grave." The mention of his father was the trigger that Adrian expected and feared. "My father was a monster," he said, surprising his cousin with the vehemence of his declaration. "An abuser who destroyed the lives of innocent women. And if our family built its reputation on covered-up crimes, maybe it's time for that reputation to crumble." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Beatrice spoke again, her voice had acquired a dangerous tone that Adrian recognized from the tensest family meetings. "You have no idea what you're saying, boy, or what you're risking. But since you've decided to choose this in person and over your own family, you'll discover exactly what that means." The call ended with a dry click that echoed like a shot. Adrian knew that Beatrice didn't make empty threats. She had built a career as a public relations expert for Boston high society, precisely by knowing where to bury scandals and how to unearth them when convenient. The retaliation began the same day. Adrian arrived at the Institute to find a crowd of reporters at the door, equipped with cameras and microphones, shouting questions about his alleged relationship with an employee. The tabloid headlines were already being printed. "Montgomery heir in sex scandal with Maid. The new case of rich and poor shakes Boston. Employee accuses magnate of abuse." The last headline made Adrian's stomach turn. Someone had completely distorted the story, transforming Elena from beloved woman to vindictive opportunist. He fought to enter the building through the crowd of journalists, desperately searching for her in the familiar corridors that now seemed hostile and foreign. He found Elena in the basement, hidden among the file shelves, silently crying while holding a cell phone that wouldn't stop ringing. When she saw him, her eyes were swollen from crying, but there was an anger there that he had never seen before. "They're saying I blackmailed you," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "That I planned everything from the beginning to get money from your family. They're painting our story as if I were a calculating prostitute who took advantage of a drunk man." Adrian embraced her immediately, feeling her tremble against his chest. "I'll deny everything," he promised. "I'll give interviews. I'll explain the truth." "The truth?" Elena pulled away from him, her eyes shining with tears of anger. "Which truth, Adrian?" "That you penetrated me without my consent on a night when I didn't even know you were awake. That afterward we fell in love like two lunatics who can't distinguish trauma from love. That your family covered up your father's crimes while my mother disappeared forever? She laughed bitterly. That truth will destroy us even faster than their lies. The cruelty of Elena's observation cut deep into Adrian's chest because it was absolutely accurate. The truth of how they met was even more scandalous than any fiction the tabloids could invent. They had built a love on foundations so fragile that any strong wind could knock it down. "So what do you want me to do?" he asked, desperate. "Lie. Deny everything and pretend you mean nothing to me." "I want you to let me go," Elena answered, and the words came out like heavy stones that fell between them. "I want you to officially fire me, pay a generous settlement for damage to reputation, and never speak to me again in your life." "No," Adrian said immediately. "I won't do that. I won't abandon you because my family decided to be cruel." "You don't understand," Elena shouted, her composure finally shattering. "I don't have a choice. They're investigating my entire life. They discovered about the orphanage, about my mother, about every moment of poverty and humiliation I've ever lived. They're turning my story into a weapon against me. And it's not just me, they're threatening Carla, my roommate. They'll make her lose her job just for living with me." The revelation hit Adrian like a punch to the stomach. His family wasn't just attacking Elena, they were targeting all the people she loved, using economic vulnerability as emotional blackmail. It was a typical strategy of Beatrice, who always preferred to destroy from the flanks rather than confront directly. "I'll stop this," he said, his voice laden with a determination he didn't know he possessed. "I'll cut all ties with them. I'll sell everything, distribute all the money, leave the country if necessary." "And then what?" Elena interrupted him. "After you destroy your entire life for me? You think I could live carrying that guilt? You think our love would survive the weight of all that sacrifice?" She approached him then, touching his face with a gentleness that brutally contrasted with the harsh words she had spoken moments before. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much it's killing me inside. But sometimes loving someone means letting them go before you destroy each other." "No," Adrian repeated, holding her face between his hands. "I won't let them win. I won't let them separate us." "You don't have a choice," Elena said, kissing him one last time with the salty taste of both their tears. "Because I'm making that choice for both of us." And before he could stop her, she had left the basement, gone up the stairs, and disappeared through the corridors of the Institute, leaving behind only the echo of her steps and the scent of lavender that would now forever be associated with his broken heart. 5 years passed like a blur of pain and reconstruction. Adrian fulfilled his promise in a way that no one, not even himself, had foreseen. The day after Elena's disappearance, he called a press conference that shook the foundations of Boston society. With a courage he didn't know he possessed, he publicly revealed his father's crimes, presented the evidence found in the room of mirrors, and denounced the family's complicity in covering up decades of abuse. The scandal was devastating. The Montgomery Foundation was temporarily closed for investigation. Several family members were indicted for complicity and obstruction of justice, and the name that for generations had been synonymous with philanthropy in Boston became cursed. Adrian lost not just his fortune, but also his family relationships, his social position, and for a time his very identity. But amid the ruins of his previous life, he found a freedom he had never experienced. Free from the suffocating expectations of Boston's elite, Adrian discovered who he really was when stripped of privileges and surnames. He worked in humble jobs, lived in simple apartments, learned the value of each dollar earned with sweat, and gradually, very gradually, he began to find a peace that had eluded him during decades of golden life. Eleanor, for her part, had disappeared from Boston the same night she said goodbye to Adrian. Carla helped her gather her few possessions and buy a bus ticket to Charleston, where a distant cousin had promised temporary shelter. In the first months in the southern city, Elena worked as a domestic, then as an attendant in an artisan shop in the French Quarter, always using a false name to avoid being found. But the pain of separation and the trauma of having her life publicly exposed had broken her in ways she didn't know how to fix. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon, when she found herself crying without apparent reason in the middle of the street, that an elderly woman named Ms. Constance approached her and asked if she needed help. Ms. Constance was a griot, a traditional storyteller, who worked with a social project in the St. Anthony's Beyond the Harbor neighborhood. She recognized in Elena someone who carried stories too heavy for one person alone, and invited her to participate in a group of women who met weekly to share narratives of pain and healing. It was in this group that Elena finally found her voice. She began by telling her own story of abandonment and invisibility, then started collecting stories from other women who had been silenced by power and poverty. She discovered she had a natural talent for preserving these narratives, for finding beauty and strength in the most painful experiences. With the support of Ms. Constance and a growing network of women who recognized in her a natural leader, Elena founded the Hope Institute, a space dedicated to the preservation of interrupted stories, especially of women marginalized by society. The Institute offered writing workshops, oral documentation of testimonies, and empowerment programs that helped women rebuild their lives after trauma. The work became her passion and her healing. With each story collected, with each woman she managed to help find her voice, Eleanor felt a piece of herself being reconstituted. She never forgot Adrian, but she learned to live with the pain of his absence, transforming it into fuel to help other women who had also been hurt by the world. It was on a December afternoon in 2029, during the inauguration of an exhibition called Echoing Voices Invisible Women of America, that Elena saw a familiar silhouette among the visitors. Adrian was standing in front of an installation that told the story of women who had mysteriously disappeared, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Alice Parker that Eleanor had managed to recover from the archives of the old institute. He was different. Thinner, with grey hair at the temples, expression lines that spoke of years of hard work and deep reflection. He wore simple but clean clothes, and there was a serenity in his posture that contrasted with the constant tension she remembered from his time as heir to the Montgomerys. For long minutes, they observed each other across the crowded hall, separated by visitors and artistic installations, but connected by an intimacy that 5 years of separation had not managed to erase. It was Elena who approached first, walking with the dignity she had learned to cultivate through years of working on her own healing. "You came," she said simply, when they met in front of her mother's photograph. "I read about the institute in the newspapers," Adrian responded, his voice deeper and more measured than she remembered. "About the work you're doing. I needed to see it with my own eyes." They walked together through the exhibition, Elena explaining each installation, each preserved story, each life that had been touched by the Institute's work. Adrian listened in silence, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated not just interest, but a deep understanding of the importance of what she had built. "You've done something extraordinary," he said when they reached the end of the exhibition. "You've transformed your pain into something that heals other people. That's beautiful." "And you?" Elena asked, studying his face that carried marks of suffering, but also of a peace that wasn't there 5 years before. "What did you do with your pain?" "I learned to live with it," he answered honestly. "I learned that sometimes the only way to repair the harm our family causes is to dedicate the rest of your life to doing good. I work with refugee resettlement now. Nothing glamorous but meaningful." They went out together to the terrace that overlooked Charleston Harbor. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the distant sound of a guitar mingled with the soft conversations of visitors who were beginning to say goodbye. "Do you forgive me?" Adrian finally asked, the question he had carried in his chest for 5 long years. Elena looked at him, at the man she had learned to love in the most impossible circumstances, who had lost everything for refusing to deny that love, who had spent years rebuilding himself to be worthy of a second chance that might never come. "There's nothing to forgive," she said, extending her hand to gently touch his face. "We were 2 broken people trying to heal through love. It worked in a way neither of us expected." "It worked?" he asked, covering her hand with his own. "You taught me that I was visible," Elena answered, "that I deserved to be seen, loved, respected. Even though our story ended in pain, it gave me the strength to rebuild my life in an authentic way. And from what I can see, it did the same for you." Adrian smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since she had known him. "Then maybe we can start again, not as the broken people we were, but as the whole people we've become." Elena looked at the harbor, at the city that had welcomed and healed her, at the man who had been simultaneously her destruction and her salvation. "Maybe we can," she agreed, and for the first time in 5 years the future seemed like a possibility instead of a sentence. They stayed there until the stars appeared in the Charleston sky, 2 survivors of a story that could have destroyed them, but instead had transformed them into truer versions of themselves. And when they finally kissed again, it was with the wisdom of those who have learned that real love isn't built in the absence of pain, but in the ability to transform that pain into something beautiful and lasting.